There was nothing as complex in the world, no flower or stone, as a single hello from a human being. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today we're talking about Lorrie Moore, specifically her 1998 short story collection, Birds of America. Formerly, I had read her 1985 short story collection, Self-Help. It's the only other of her repertoire that I have read. I've read some essays about Lorrie Moore, but as far as her work, it is currently limited to the stories in Self-Help and now Birds of America. Moore is one of those writers who definitely has her thing, her niche, her style, and she does that very well. I think that if you were to read her, I know that Everyman has an omnibus of her short story collections that recently came out. I think if you were to sit down and read her stories back to back without some time in between, I think that it could get a little monotonous and maddening. That goes for most writers, of course, because she does have this very specific content, this very specific view of the world and her way of portraying it. And her way of portraying it, I've sometimes taken to calling it uncomfortable realism. And someone recently on Goodreads coined a good adjective, funny sad. But in the end, what Moore does so well is she gives expression to what it is to be conscious in this world. And specifically that expression, or primarily through women. For example, in the hard-hitting and often surprising short story called Real Estate, she has the main character, Ruth. The narrator says she felt the opposite of sexy. She felt busy, managerial, thirsty, crazy. Everything, when you got right down to it, was the opposite of sexy. And I think this hits on something so crucial because there is this pressure from society on women to always be sexy. But let's face it, as you know, day-to-day tasks come up and you go through your work day and you've got this to manage and this to think about and oh, let me get this ready. And oftentimes you just don't feel sexy. And I know I'm speaking on behalf of women, but again, a lot of this insight, this good insight into the humanity of women comes through very well in Moore, and that makes her indispensable for, I would say, especially for male readers, because it just lends this very incisive view that we often don't think about, or that often gets buried or overridden by the admittedly capitalist pressures of society and marketing and popular consciousness. I say that reading too much of Moore's stories can be maddening, and that's because you will often find yourself all but shouting at characters for their behavior. Because in Moore's world, people are helpless. They have no self-control. They make horrible decisions. But again, this is also the whole point of, good fiction, good writing. Well, let's take the opening line, the famous opening line from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. It says, all happy families are alike, but unhappy families are unhappy in unique ways, or something like that. And that is exactly what Moore plays on. She takes, hey, happiness is happiness, and there's nothing really, interesting there for fiction and for a more complex portrayal of the world. So let's really dig into this unhappiness. For example, in the story, again, Real Estate, certain things helped. The occasional Winston, convinced as Ruth was, despite the one lung, the lip blisters, and the colloidal track across her ribs, that at the end she would regret the cigarettes she hadn't smoked more than the ones she had. Now, my knee-jerk reaction is to yell at Ruth, "What is wrong with you?" But we have to be honest, that justification in the end, she would regret the cigarettes she hadn't smoked more than the ones she had. We know that's not quite true. When you're getting ready to die of lung cancer because of smoking, probably you're not going to sit there on your deathbed and think, man, I regret the times that I could have smoked and didn't. You're going to regret all the times you did smoke. But what Moore is painting is that part of us that does feel helpless and does let our temptations and our unmediated, our unethicized inclinations, let them roam free. That impulse that's in humanity, that's what she's putting on display. And in the short story form, you're always pushing the limits. You have a very compressed and tight framework to work in. And the short story writers who do the genre the best are the ones who just push it over the edge. Not quite into the, or at least in what I'm calling uncomfortable realism, not quite into slapstick, because then you'll lose the focus. But Moore just toes this line so well, putting on display our wretched humanness wrapped in a subtle irony that will maintain tension, which really, let's face it, that's what keeps our interest. In a Lorrie Moore story, marriage can be a means of overcoming the grief of your dead pet. Mothers hound their daughters about being better. Fathers are distant or not even present at all. Boyfriends cheat and wives cheat. It's just what happens. Again, people have no self-control. They're helpless, hopeless in many cases. And the stages of bereavement or grief include Haagen-Dazs. A lot of these, in fact, 11 of the 12 short stories in here were previously published in different forms, maybe under different titles, in Harper's, New York Times, The New Yorker, Paris Review, and so on. They're very much a product of the 90s culture, late 80s, 90s culture. You'll get Jenny Craig shows up. Well, not the person Jenny Craig, but the diet that was all the rave in the 90s. References to Forrest Gump and other movies of the era will come up. In some of the more politically tinged stories, NAFTA, Bosnia, the former Yugoslavia will all come up. She'll have these great images, these great similes, like in the story, Which Is More Than I Can Say About Some People. She says, they stayed at a tiny stucco bed and breakfast, one with a thatched roof like Cleopatra bangs. In the story, Community Life, she says, there was something animated in his eyes, like pond life. So simple, but I found that really stirred my mind's eye. She usually didn't like espresso, its gritty, cigarish taste, but there was in the air that kind of distortion that bent you a little. Let's pause right there. But there was in the air that kind of distortion that bent you a little. It caused your usual self to grow slippery, to wander off and shop, to get blurry, bleed, bevel with possibility. We've all felt that before, especially when we're trying out something that we've never enjoyed before on this weird whim, because, as Moore has it, the air had this kind of distortion that bent you a little. Here's a description of an affair in classic Lorrie Moore style from the short story Charades. She is also having, this is like it's an aside, she is also having an affair with a young assistant DA in the prosecutor's office, but it is a limited thing, like taking her gloves off, clapping her hands, and putting the gloves back on again. I've never read a description of an affair quite like that. In her story, What You Want to Do, Fine, here's a description of people. In general, people were not roadmaps. People were not hieroglyphs or books. They were not stories. A person was a collection of accidents. This is again from What You Want to Do, Fine. This is a great description for the classic Lorrie Moore character. He feels weary, although it's normally a girl. He feels weary. He also feels sick of trying, tired of living, and scared of dying. And remember, this came out in '98. right around the time that, for example, David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest came out, and so much other fiction about this feeling that was in the air. And this captures it. People who are sick of trying, tired of living, and scared of dying. This is exactly what David Foster Wallace was trying to pin down in Infinite Jest and push beyond just describing it and explaining it, which Moore does so well. But his sight was on what is a solution. Lorrie Moore, being well acquainted with the Midwest, gives us this great description of the Midwest. This is from People Like That Are the Only People Here. She says, beneath her lie the gentle undulations of the Midwest, with all its aspirations to be what? To be Long Island. How it has succeeded, strip mall upon strip mall, lurid water, poisoned potatoes. There's a Yale lecture that's available online through their open course platform, and it's instructed by Langdon Hammer. It's on modern poetry, and in one of, I can't remember if it's one of the lectures on Crane, if there is a lecture on devoted to Crane. Wallace Stevens. One of the lectures on Wallace Stevens, he talks about how a student once asked him, are any poets happy? And his response is brilliant. He said, no good ones. The same could be said about Lorrie Moore, or writers in general, because you get the sense of this just oppressive unhappiness, but it lends itself to beautiful artistic expression, and in this case, short stories. In the opening story, Willing, a 40-year-old former actress, is now living alone at a Days Inn in Chicago, and she tries to have a relationship with an auto mechanic who cheats on her, and it's so helpless. And she draws this distinction. She, being Lorrie Moore, she uses this to draw a distinction between willing and talent, or will and talent, to great nuance and effect. In the next story, Which Is More Than I Can Say About Some People, Abby's mother basically uses that as her refrain, her intimation, of course, her rhetorical commentary on her daughter's life. Community Life is another one of the great stories in here. Olina loves books. She's turned off by French theory. She works in a library. You can see a lot of Moore coming out in this character, Olina. And we talk about Romanian immigrants that are trying to integrate in America. Olina's parents die. She works in a university library. She meets and moves in with a guy named Nick. But there's this clash between Olina, who has ideals that are rooted in literature, and Nick, who has ideals rooted in politics, but in that false front politics. And this is what Olina hates. So this is pitting the two ideals, the two ideologies together, which is something I'm always interested in. By the time we get to the story Agnes of Iowa, we realize that names are very important to Lorrie Moore. In fact, usually within the opening sentence, we'll have the proper name of the person. Agnes is a plain girl from a plain town, and she wants to hide that. She longs to be more cosmopolitan. In the midst of all this, this visiting scholar or visiting writer from South Africa comes to give a talk, and there's this really strange encounter, the subtleness of which I didn't catch on the first read. But it causes her to realize that she and her husband, who's 12 years her senior, have grown old very quickly. At one point, Agnes realizes that she's saying stuff that her mother used to say. And our narrator gives us this: the functional disenchantment, the sweet habit of each other, had begun to put lines around her mouth. Lines that looked like quotation marks, as if everything she said had already been said before. That's amazing. Using lines and wrinkles that come with age to connect to quotation marks, so that everything coming out of her mouth is wrapped in these physical quotation marks that just reinforces this idea that she's becoming her mother, despite all of her efforts to hide her origins. The title of the story, Charades, works on two levels. On the first, most immediate level, this is a tradition of a family getting together at Christmas and playing the actual game of charades. But it also hints at the charades we play are the roles we perform during such gatherings as a family at Christmas. And it is very uncomfortable. Again, uncomfortable realism. In the story, Four Calling Birds, Three French Hens, a woman is bereaving the death of her cat near Christmas time, and she finds a psychoanalyst who promises to have her cured by Christmas. Really interesting story here. Beautiful Grade is an interesting story, a clash of intellects, which happens very often. Lots of scholars getting together, professors. Good friends Bill and Albert and others are having a dinner to celebrate Albert's third divorce. Bill is a law professor who's dating a 24-year-old, which is making everyone uncomfortable. He has decided to start living in the present tense, and mimetically, the whole story is written in the present tense. But there's all kinds of banter and uncomfortable dialogue through this dinner that they're having, mostly about love and war. And what we start to see is that there's this huge generational gap between the characters, these professors, and their students, and including the young girl that Bill is dating. And there's one moment, this just sharp, impactful moment when Debbie, meaning Debbie is the young girl, 24 years old. Bill presumably is somewhere maybe in his late 40s. But it says she begins to cry, and as she does, something cracks open in her, and Bill sees straight through to her heart. It is a good heart. It has had nice parents and good friends, lived only during peacetime, and been kind to animals. Within the context of the story, that is one of the most impactful moments where it says that she has lived only during peacetime. In the short story Real Estate, which again I said is one of my favorites, Ruth and Terrence decide to sell their house and move. And what ends up happening here is that Moore uses the concept of real estate and all that it entails, selling one house and buying another and moving. She draws striking parallels between that and human relationships. People like that are the only people here canonical babbling in ped-onc. And we'll find out that ped-onc is shorthand for pediatric oncology. So a mother finds that her baby boy has a malignant tumor on his kidney. And her husband is constantly telling her, she's apparently a fiction writer, and her husband is constantly saying to her, "Are you taking notes?" And so what happens is this story becomes the notes she has taken. But this is, and there's a bittersweet punchline at the end that really affirms that adjective applied to Lorrie Moore as funny sad. But there's lots of commentary in here on art and creativity and writing. This is probably the most powerful story in the whole collection. And finally, to close it all off, the story Terrific Mother. An aging woman without a child marries an academic and accompanies him to Italy for a sort of conference or retreat with a bunch of scholars, but she finds that she's one of the spouses. And this has a condescending annotation to it. The whole thing kicks off with her accidentally killing someone's baby. And this is, again, classic Lorrie Moore. I highly, highly recommend Lorrie Moore's short stories. Again, I've read the collection Self-Help and now Birds in America. One thing that this did for me that not all short story collections do is it really, really stirred the writer, the aspiring writer within me. It just made me want to write. It really reaffirmed the power that fiction has, and especially in the short story form, which is not an easy form to write in, but the power and the potential of expression in this form really stirred something within me and made me want to write.